It all started like any other day, a routine life, an ordinary existence, until it wasn't. I never imagined that my life would be entwined with the fate of an entire galaxy. One minute, I was just another human living out my days on Earth, and the next, I found myself standing before an alien queen who had declared me her chosen consort. How could this have happened? I was just a man, a regular human being, but to her, Queen Saralina of the Zorthian Empire, I was more. I had no idea what that more was, but I was about to find out. It began with a simple but completely unexpected event. A visitation by the Zorthians, a race of advanced beings who hailed from a distant star system. Their arrival was met with awe and fear across Earth. They were far more technologically advanced, their ships gleaming like silver daggers in the sky. But what stunned humanity even more was the declaration from their queen, an announcement that rippled through the galaxy. Queen Saralina had chosen a human consort. That consort was me. I remember the moment vividly. I was going about my day, minding my own business, when a blinding light appeared above my apartment building. I thought it was some kind of malfunctioning drone, or maybe a prank. But then the air around me crackled with energy, and suddenly I was no longer on Earth. I stood aboard a vast ship, a craft so advanced that the technology within it made anything from Earth seem like primitive toys in comparison. Before me stood Queen Saralina, her regal figure cloaked in flowing robes of shimmering stardust. Her skin was a pale, ethereal blue, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that made me feel like she could see right through me. She was beautiful in an alien, otherworldly way, tall, statuesque, and radiating an aura of power that made me weak at the knees. The weight of her gaze bore down on me, and for a moment I couldn't speak. What was happening? Why had I been brought here? My people have watched your kind for centuries, she said, her voice like music, deep and melodic, but with an edge of command. You, human, are different. You have been chosen. Chosen? For what? I stammered, completely at a loss. To be my consort, she declared, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Me, a consort to an alien queen? This had to be some kind of mistake. But as I stood there, feeling the sheer presence of this powerful being, I realized that she wasn't joking, and this was no dream. The implications began to sink in. I was now tied to one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. But as quickly as the realization struck me, so too did the danger. The union between Queen Saralina and a human was bound to cause waves, politically, culturally, and personally. It was a move that would shake the very foundation of galactic politics, and not everyone would be happy about it. Saralina, regal and poised, continued, her voice soft but firm. The Zorthian Empire is vast, spanning multiple star systems. We are a race built on strength, unity, and power. But even power must be tempered with something else, compassion. That is why I chose you. Me? I'm just a human. I don't understand. My voice trembled slightly. You do not need to understand just yet, she replied. In time you will learn. But for now, you must trust that I have seen something in you that others have not. Together, we will lead. There was no room for argument. I had been plucked from my simple life and thrust into a role that seemed impossible to fill. But it was real, too real. The Zorthians, I soon learned, were a proud and complex people, steeped in a rigid hierarchy and an ancient set of traditions. For their queen to choose a human consort was unheard of, almost blasphemous in the eyes of some. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a political statement, one that would send shockwaves through the galaxy. As the days passed aboard her ship, I began to understand the magnitude of what I was involved in. The Zorthians were not just any alien race. They were a dominant force, ruling with strength and wisdom. But Saralina's decision to bring a human into their highest ranks sparked tension. The other factions within the Empire were already questioning her rule, and now they had another reason to doubt her judgment. That's when the power struggle began. The whispers of dissent spread quickly, like wildfire through the corridors of the royal palace and into the farthest reaches of the empire. The Zorthian nobility, who had long viewed their queen as an untouchable and godlike figure, were now split. Some saw her choice to take a human as a symbol of unity, a bold move to bring new perspectives into the empire. But others, especially those in the more conservative, militaristic factions, saw it as a betrayal of their values and traditions. I wasn't naive. I could see the sideways glances, hear the murmurs of disapproval from the courtiers and advisors as I walked beside Saralina. They viewed me as an outsider, an inferior being not worthy of standing in their presence. To them, I was a curiosity at best, a dangerous liability at worst. Saralina, however, remained unwavering. She was a force to be reckoned with, and despite the mounting tension, she carried herself with the grace and confidence of a queen who had faced countless challenges. Yet, even as she reassured me that we were on the right path, I could sense the weight of the burden she carried. Her people were on the verge of rebellion, and the decision to choose a human consort had only added fuel to the fire. The first real sign of trouble came during a council meeting with her top advisors. It was a grand affair, held in a hall made of shimmering crystal that reflected the light in 1,000 different directions. The Zorthian council members were seated in a semicircle, their expressions cold and unreadable, as Saralina took her place at the head of the room. I stood at her side, feeling the weight of 100 disapproving eyes on me. The meeting began with the usual formalities, discussions about the Empire's defense strategies, resource management, and diplomatic relations with other star systems. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift. One of the counselors, an older Zorthian with sharp features and an air of authority, stood and addressed the Queen directly. His name was General Valox, a military leader known for his hardline stance on tradition and his deep mistrust of outsiders. "Your Majesty," Valox began, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "While we are grateful for your continued leadership, there are concerns. Concerns about the future of our empire. Concerns about the choices you have made." His eyes flicked toward me, and though he didn't say it outright, the implication was clear. I was the problem. Saralina remained calm, her expression unchanging. "General Valox, you speak of concerns, yet you have not provided any specifics. If there is an issue, I suggest you speak plainly." Valox's gaze hardened. "The issue, Your Majesty, is the choice you have made to bring a human into the fold of our empire. It is unprecedented, unwise, and frankly, dangerous. Our people do not understand this decision. They fear it, and fear, as you know, can lead to instability." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the first time anyone had spoken so openly against me in Saralina's presence. I wanted to speak up, to defend myself, but I knew that this wasn't my battle to fight. Not yet. Saralina, however, was not one to back down. She rose from her seat, her presence commanding as she addressed the room. "I am fully aware of the concerns regarding my choice," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a queen who had ruled for decades. "But let me be clear, I did not make this decision lightly. I chose my consort because I see in him the qualities that our empire needs in this time of change: strength, compassion, and the ability to bridge the gap between our people and others." Valox's eyes narrowed. "But Your Majesty, the Zorthian people do not need a bridge to humanity. We are a proud race, one that has thrived for millennia without the interference of outsiders. What can this human possibly offer us that we do not already possess?" Saralina's gaze never wavered. "He offers us a new perspective, a way forward that does not rely on the same cycles of violence and conquest that have defined our past. The galaxy is changing, General, and if we do not adapt, we will be left behind." There was a murmur of discontent among the council members, but Saralina's words had clearly struck a nerve. She was challenging the very foundation of their beliefs, and they didn't know how to respond. But Valox wasn't finished. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "With all due respect, your decision to bring this human into our ranks has already sown the seeds of division. There are those among us who believe that this experiment will lead to the downfall of the Zorthian Empire. And if you continue down this path, you may find that the loyalty of your people is not as steadfast as you believe." The threat was clear, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Saralina's eyes. The power struggle was real, and it was growing by the day. After the council meeting, I could feel the tension in the air thickening like a storm cloud on the horizon. I wasn't blind to the fact that my presence in Saralina's court had caused a rift. The Zorthian Empire was vast and complex, with centuries of tradition and hierarchy governing its every move. To them, I was not just a human, I was a disruption, a symbol of change they were not ready for. Saralina, for her part, remained resolute. But I could see the strain it was taking on her. Each day, we faced new challenges. Rumors of dissent among the military, whispers of discontent from the noble houses, and even talk of rebellion. The weight of the empire rested on her shoulders, and while she was a queen accustomed to bearing that burden, this time felt different. I couldn't help but feel guilty. Had I not been chosen as her consort, would things have been easier for her? Would the empire still be united, or had my arrival sparked a conflict that could not be contained? One evening, as we sat together in her private chambers, I voiced my concerns. Saralina, I can see what's happening. The tension, the unrest. It's because of me, isn't it? She looked at me, her eyes softening for a moment before she shook her head. You are not the cause of this, my consort. The unrest you see has been brewing for years. The factions within our empire have always struggled for power, and your presence has merely brought those divisions to the surface. But it's made things worse, I said, unable to hide the frustration in my voice. You're facing a power struggle because of me. Maybe if I weren't here. Saralina cut me off, her voice firm. No, you are here because I chose you. Do not doubt that choice. The path forward will be difficult, yes, but it is the right path. We cannot continue to rule as we have for centuries. The galaxy is changing, and if we do not change with it, we will fall. I wanted to believe her, but the doubt lingered in my mind. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. I was no longer just a human caught in an alien court. I was a key player in a galactic struggle for power, and that realization weighed heavily on me. As the days passed, the situation grew more precarious. The factions within the Empire were becoming more vocal in their opposition to Saralina's rule. The conservative factions, led by General Valox and his military supporters, were openly challenging her authority, while other, more progressive factions cautiously supported her vision for the future. But it was clear that the Empire was teetering on the edge of civil war. Saralina's advisors urged her to take decisive action, to crush the dissent before it could grow into full-blown rebellion. But she refused. She believed that violence would only lead to more division, and she was determined to find a peaceful solution. It was a noble stance, but it was also a dangerous one. One night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The tension had reached a boiling point, and it seemed like only a matter of time before the conflict erupted into violence. I don't understand why you chose me, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not a leader. I'm not a warrior. I don't have the skills to help you in this fight. Saralina turned to me, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the room. I chose you because you have something the others do not. You see things differently. You are not bound by the traditions of my people or the expectations of the court. You are free to think, to feel, and to act in ways that others cannot. That is why I chose you. Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fear that gnawed at my insides. The power struggle within the Zorthian Empire was escalating, and I had no idea how to navigate the treacherous waters of galactic politics. I was just a man, thrust into a role that I had never asked for, and the weight of it was crushing me. But I couldn't back down. Saralina needed me, and the future of the Empire depended on us finding a way to unite the factions before it was too late. The turning point came sooner than I expected. It was during a grand diplomatic banquet held to celebrate the signing of a peace treaty with one of the Empire's neighboring star systems. The event was meant to showcase the strength and unity of the Zorthian Empire, but instead it became the catalyst for the chaos that had been brewing for weeks. As the night wore on, I noticed that the atmosphere in the grand hall was tense. The conversations were stilted, and I could see the mistrust in the eyes of many of the guests. General Valox was there, of course, his presence casting a long shadow over the proceedings. Then, without warning, the doors to the banquet hall burst open, and a group of armed soldiers stormed in. The shock of the intrusion froze everyone in place. The grand hall, once filled with the murmur of uneasy conversation, was now gripped by a deadly silence. The armed soldiers, their weapons gleaming under the bright lights, spread out across the room with chilling precision, their faces stern and unyielding. At the head of the group was General Valox. I had known from the beginning that Valox was a threat, but this open display of defiance was beyond anything I had anticipated. This wasn't just a challenge to Saralina's authority. This was an outright coup. The tension that had simmered for weeks had finally boiled over, and now it was erupting in violence. Saralina, ever the picture of regal composure, rose from her seat at the head of the banquet table. She did not look afraid, though I could see the flicker of anger in her eyes. "General Valox," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What is the meaning of this?" The Valox stepped forward, his military uniform immaculate, his expression cold. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The time has come for a change. You have ruled this empire with compassion and mercy, but those virtues have made you weak. The Zorthian people deserve a leader who understands strength, a leader who will not compromise our traditions for the sake of outsiders." His gaze landed on me as he spoke, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had known that my presence in Saralina's court had been a source of tension, but I hadn't realized just how deep that resentment ran. To Valox and his followers, I wasn't just an inconvenience. I was the embodiment of everything they believed was wrong with Saralina's rule. "You would betray your queen?" Saralina asked, her voice steady but laced with fury. "I would save our people," Valox replied, his eyes narrowing. "Your choices have put the Zorthian Empire on the path to ruin. I will not stand by and watch as you drag us down into oblivion. The people deserve better. They deserve a leader who will protect them." The soldiers around him raised their weapons, and the tension in the room became unbearable. I could see the fear in the eyes of the other guests, noblemen, diplomats, and courtiers who had come to celebrate a peace treaty, now caught in the middle of a power struggle that threatened to tear the empire apart. I wanted to stand up to defend Saralina, but I knew that any sudden movement could spark the violence that was teetering on the edge of breaking out. I was no warrior, and I had no weapon. All I could do was sit and watch as the situation spiraled out of control. But Saralina was not one to be intimidated. She stepped forward, her presence commanding as she addressed the soldiers who had once sworn their loyalty to her. "You think this will save our people?" she asked, her voice sharp and cutting. "You think that violence and betrayal will bring strength to the Zorthian Empire? You are wrong, Valox. Strength does not come from fear, it comes from unity. And by turning against me, you are fracturing the very foundation of our empire." Valox sneered. "Spare me your rhetoric, Your Majesty. The time for words is over. The time for action is now." With a swift motion, he raised his hand, and the soldiers began to advance. Panic erupted in the hall as the guests scrambled to their feet, some trying to flee, others frozen in place by the sudden danger. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. This was it. This was the moment when everything would fall apart. But before the soldiers could reach Saralina, a blinding light filled the room. I didn't know what was happening at first. The light was so intense that it felt like the entire room was being consumed by it. I shielded my eyes, trying to make sense of the chaos around me, but the sound of shouting and the clatter of weapons falling to the floor drowned out any hope of understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. When I opened my eyes, I saw Saralina standing in the center of the room, her hand raised and glowing with an ethereal energy. The soldiers who had been advancing on her were now on the ground, unconscious or disoriented, their weapons scattered around them. Valox stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. Saralina lowered her hand, her expression cold and unforgiving. "You have forgotten who I am, General," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I am the Queen of the Zorthian Empire, and I will not be so easily overthrown." Valox's shock quickly turned to anger. He drew his weapon, a sleek, alien blade that shimmered with a deadly energy, and charged at Saralina with a roar of fury. Before I could react, Saralina moved with a speed and grace that left me breathless. In a blur of motion, she deflected Valox's attack with a wave of her hand, sending him crashing to the floor. The power struggle that had been simmering for weeks had finally come to a head. Valox lay sprawled on the floor, his blade clattering beside him as he struggled to rise. His face was twisted in rage and humiliation, but there was something else there too, fear. For the first time, the hardened general, who had built his reputation on strength and intimidation, realized that he had underestimated Queen Saralina. The room, once filled with the sound of panic and chaos, was now eerily silent. Every eye was on Saralina as she stood over Valox, her figure illuminated by the residual glow of the power she had just unleashed. It was a stark reminder of who she was, not just a queen, but a ruler imbued with a strength that went beyond physical prowess. Valox, breathing heavily, forced himself to his knees. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice thick with defiance. "You may have won today, but you cannot stop what is coming. The people, they will not follow you after this. You've shown them your true face, a queen willing to use force against her own." Saralina's expression remained calm, but her eyes were cold as ice. "The people will see that I defended them from a traitor who sought to divide us," she said, her voice steady. "They will see that I stand for unity, not for fear and chaos." Valox's gaze flickered toward the guests who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Some were still frozen in shock, while others were cautiously watching Saralina, their fear slowly giving way to respect. It was clear that her display of power had left an indelible mark, not just on the traitors, but on everyone in the room. Saralina's eyes bore into Valox. "You will answer for your treason, General. But know this, your actions have not only endangered my reign, they have endangered the very future of our empire. The Zorthian people will not be divided by your fear-mongering. We will stand united." With a final wave of her hand, she gestured for the royal guards, those still loyal to her, to step forward and take Valox into custody. The general, realizing he had no more cards to play, scowled in defeat as the guards roughly bound his wrists and dragged him from the hall. The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, but the aftershocks of the attempted coup lingered. The guests, still visibly shaken, began to murmur among themselves, uncertain of what the future held. It was clear that the rebellion had been crushed, for now, but the underlying divisions within the empire remained. I stood by Saralina's side, my heart still racing from the adrenaline of the confrontation. I had never witnessed anything like it before. The sheer power she had wielded, the way she had faced down her enemies without flinching. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. But as the dust settled, I realized that the power struggle was far from over. Valox may have been defeated, but his influence had spread far beyond the walls of the royal palace. There were still factions within the empire that supported his vision, factions that would not rest until they saw Saralina removed from power. Later that night, as we returned to her private chambers, I could see the weight of the day's events beginning to take its toll on Saralina. She had remained strong in front of the court, but now, in the privacy of her quarters, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "You should rest," I said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've been through enough for one day." Saralina sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as she sat down on the edge of the bed. "Rest will not change the fact that my empire is on the brink of collapse," she said quietly. "Valox was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. There are others who still oppose me, others who will stop at nothing to see me fall." I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. I wasn't a politician or a military leader. I didn't have the answers to the complex problems that plagued the Zorthian Empire. But I knew one thing: I couldn't let her face this alone. "I don't know what's going to happen next," I admitted, my voice soft. "But I do know that I'm not going anywhere. I'll stand by your side, no matter what." Saralina turned to look at me, her violet eyes shimmering with something I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. For all her strength, for all her power, she was still just one person, fighting against forces that were larger than either of us. And in that moment, I realized just how much she needed someone she could trust. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I chose you for a reason, and now, more than ever, I see that I made the right choice." We sat together in silence for a long time, the weight of the day's events pressing down on us. Outside, the stars glittered in the night sky, indifferent to the struggles that played out below. But inside, I knew that we were on the precipice of something much larger than ourselves. The power struggle within the Zorthian Empire was far from over, and the road ahead would be fraught with danger. But I was ready to face it, by Saralina's side. The following days were a whirlwind of political maneuvering and strategic decisions. Valox's failed coup had sent shockwaves through the Empire, and while many of Saralina's supporters rallied to her side in the aftermath, there were still pockets of resistance simmering beneath the surface. The tension was palpable, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. Saralina's leadership was put to the ultimate test. She had to maintain control of the Empire, quelling the unrest that Valox had stirred up while simultaneously addressing the concerns of her people. She walked a fine line, balancing strength with compassion, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. But Saralina was not alone. Despite my initial doubts about my role in the Zorthian court, I had become more than just a consort. I was her confidant, her partner, and in some ways, her greatest ally. While I may not have had the political experience of the Zorthian nobility or the military prowess of Valox's generals, I offered something else, an outside perspective. Saralina often confided in me, seeking my advice on matters that had nothing to do with battle strategies or imperial politics. She valued my human intuition, my ability to see things in ways that others could not. And as the days turned into weeks, I found myself becoming more and more immersed in the intricacies of the Empire's governance. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, factions within the Empire trying to undermine Saralina's authority, rumors of rebellion brewing in the outer star systems, and the constant threat of assassination hanging over both of us. But through it all, Saralina remained steadfast, her resolve unshaken. One evening, as we sat together in the royal gardens, Saralina shared something with me that shook me to my core. "There is something you must know," she said, her voice quiet as she gazed up at the twin moons hanging low in the sky. "Something that I have kept hidden from everyone, even my most trusted advisors." I frowned, sensing the seriousness of her tone. "What is it?" Saralina hesitated for a moment before turning to face me. "The Zorthian Empire is not as invincible as it appears. For years, we have maintained our power through strength and diplomacy, but there are forces at work beyond our control. Forces that threaten the very foundation of our empire." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "There are those who seek to destroy us from within," she continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "But there are also external threats. Other empires, other races that see us as a threat to their dominance. They are waiting for the right moment to strike, and with the internal divisions we are facing, that moment may come sooner than we think." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy fog. I had known that the Empire was facing challenges, but I hadn't realized the full extent of the danger. We were not just fighting against the rebels within our own ranks. We were standing on the precipice of a galactic war. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Saralina's gaze was steady as she replied, "We must unite the Empire. We must show strength, but we must also show wisdom. The decisions we make in the coming weeks will determine the fate of the Zorthian Empire, and possibly the entire galaxy." The enormity of the situation was staggering. I had been brought into Saralina's world as a consort, but now I was being thrust into the heart of a struggle that spanned star systems and entire civilizations. The choices we made in the days ahead would not only affect us, they would shape the future of the galaxy. As I sat there, staring up at the moons, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the responsibility that had been placed upon us. We were fighting not just for our own survival, but for the survival of an entire way of life. And in that moment, I knew that there was no turning back. We would face the challenges ahead together, and whatever the outcome, we would do so as partners. The following weeks were some of the most challenging of my life. Saralina and I worked tirelessly to hold the Empire together, but the cracks in its foundation were deepening. The coup attempt had left its mark, and even though Valox was imprisoned, his influence lingered in the shadows. There were still those who supported his vision of a more militaristic, xenophobic Zorthian empire, one that saw humanity and other species as inferior and unworthy of alliance. The external threat Saralina had mentioned also loomed larger than ever. Reports of skirmishes along the Empire's borders were becoming more frequent, and the diplomatic relations that had once been so carefully maintained were beginning to unravel. It was clear that the Zorthian Empire was in a precarious position, and the wrong move could send us spiraling into a war we were not prepared to fight. Despite all of this, Saralina remained a beacon of strength. She refused to give in to the fear and pressure that surrounded her. She was a queen who led by example, and every decision she made was done with the intention of preserving not just her rule, but the lives of her people. But even the strongest of rulers cannot bear such a burden alone. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations with a neighboring star system, Saralina finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. We were alone in her chambers, the soft glow of the alien moonlight filtering through the windows as she sat at the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The weight of the Empire, it's crushing me." I knelt beside her, gently taking her hands in mine. "You don't have to carry it alone," I said softly. "I'm here with you. We'll face this together." She looked up at me, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But what if I fail? What if everything I've worked for, everything we've built, falls apart?" "You won't fail," I replied, my voice firm. "You've come too far, and you've fought too hard to let this empire crumble. And even if the worst happens, even if we lose everything, we'll rebuild. Together." Saralina held my gaze for a long moment, and then, with a soft sigh, she leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for her, and it reminded me that beneath the crown and the power, she was still just a person. A person who had been thrust into a position of immense responsibility and was doing her best to navigate the impossible. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of the galaxy pressing down on us both. But in that silence, there was also a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that, no matter what came next, we would face it together. The days that followed were filled with tense negotiations, strategic meetings, and sleepless nights. But through it all, Saralina and I grew closer than ever. Our bond had deepened beyond that of queen and consort. It was a partnership built on trust, respect, and an unwavering commitment to each other and to the future of the Zorthian Empire. And as the tensions within the Empire continued to mount, I knew that we were nearing a turning point. The power struggle that had been simmering for months was about to reach its climax, and the choices we made in the days ahead would determine the fate of the galaxy. The final battle was approaching, and there was no room for error. The culmination of the power struggle came in the form of a fateful confrontation, a moment that would forever alter the course of the Zorthian Empire. It had been weeks since Valox's failed coup, but the unrest he had sown continued to grow. His loyalists, though diminished in number, had retreated to the fringes of the empire, gathering their strength and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when word reached us that Valox's followers had launched a coordinated attack on one of the Empire's border planets, sparking a conflict that threatened to drag us into a full-scale civil war. Saralina knew that decisive action was needed. If we allowed Valox's rebellion to spread, it could tear the Empire apart. But she also knew that responding with overwhelming force could push the galaxy into chaos, bringing even more destruction. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Saralina made her most daring decision yet. "We cannot fight this war with weapons alone," she told me one night, her voice filled with quiet determination. "If we want to end this conflict, we need to reach the hearts and minds of our people. We need to show them that unity is our greatest strength." I nodded, understanding what she meant. "But how? Valox's followers are entrenched. They won't listen to reason." "They may not," she admitted, "but there are still many who are undecided, those who have been swayed by fear but have not yet fully committed to rebellion. If we can show them that there is another way, that we can find peace without tearing the empire apart, we may still have a chance." And so, Saralina devised a plan. A bold, unprecedented plan that would take us to the heart of the conflict. She would go to the border planet herself, unarmed, and meet with the leaders of the rebellion face to face. It was a risky move, one that could easily result in her capture, or worse. But Saralina believed that it was the only way to prevent the galaxy from descending into chaos. Despite my reservations, I stood by her side as we prepared for the mission. We knew that the odds were stacked against us, but we also knew that we couldn't afford to back down. The day of the meeting arrived, and Saralina and I boarded a small, unassuming ship bound for the border planet. The atmosphere was tense as we made our approach, knowing that we were flying into the heart of enemy territory. But Saralina remained calm, her resolve unshaken. As we landed on the planet's surface, we were met by a contingent of Velox's loyalists, armed, suspicious, and clearly prepared for a fight. But Saralina stepped forward with grace, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I come to speak," she announced, her voice carrying across the open plain. Not as a queen, but as a fellow Zorthian who seeks unity. There was a long, tense silence as the rebels sized her up, their hands hovering over their weapons. But then, one of the leaders, a hardened soldier with a scar running down his face, stepped forward. "You've got courage, Your Majesty," he said, his voice laced with both respect and bitterness. "But courage won't win this war." "No," Saralina agreed, "but unity will." For the next several hours, Saralina and I stood before the rebels, making our case for peace. It was a difficult conversation, filled with anger, distrust, and years of pent-up resentment. But slowly, gradually, we began to make progress. The rebels listened, not all of them, but enough to plant the seeds of doubt in their minds. In the end, it wasn't force that won the day. It was Saralina's unwavering belief in the power of unity. And as we left the border planet, the seeds of rebellion that Velox had sown began to wither and die. The Zorthian Empire was far from perfect, but it had been saved from the brink of destruction. And together, Saralina and I would continue to fight for its future, side by side, as partners in both love and leadership.